My mother, Patricia Williams, had always been clear about my place in the family hierarchy. As the middle child between two accomplished siblings, I had grown accustomed to being viewed as the underachiever, the one who lacked the natural business instincts that seemed to run in our bloodline. My older sister Jennifer was a corporate lawyer at a prestigious firm, my younger brother Michael was a successful investment banker, and Mom herself had built Williams Consulting into what appeared to be a thriving management consultancy. Meanwhile, I worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized research firm, lived in a modest apartment, and drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan. To anyone observing our family dynamics, the contrast was obvious. I was the cautious, risk-averse child who had settled for stability over ambition. What none of them knew was that 4 years ago, when Mom's consulting firm was struggling to secure the growth capital needed to expand beyond its regional client base, I had quietly arranged for my venture capital fund to provide the $12 million in series of funding that had transformed Williams Consulting from a small boutique firm into a major player in the management consulting space. Not as her son, but through a carefully structured investment vehicle that kept my identity completely hidden from all parties involved. Mom believed she had impressed a group of sophisticated institutional investors with her business plan and growth projections. In reality, she had been pitching to representatives managing my capital. The decision to fund her hadn't been sentimental. Williams Consulting had genuine potential. Mom possessed real expertise in organizational development and change management. Her client retention rates were exceptional, and the market for strategic consulting services was expanding rapidly. The business fundamentals were solid, even if Mom's tendency to micromanage and take credit for her team's insights created some operational challenges. Over the following years, as Williams Consulting continued to grow and required additional funding rounds, I had participated through various investment entities controlled by my venture capital fund. Series B brought another $18 million. Bridge financing added $8 million more. By the current valuation, I controlled approximately 67% of Williams Consulting through a network of investment vehicles, while Mom owned roughly 22% of the company she had founded. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every family gathering where Mom explained the complexities of running a successful consulting firm, she was essentially describing my investment back to me. Every time she criticized my lack of entrepreneurial vision or inability to think strategically, she was talking to the person whose capital had made her success possible. This particular family dinner was taking place at Mom's house in the upscale suburb where she had moved after Williams Consulting's rapid expansion. The house itself, a sprawling colonial with marble countertops and a 3-car garage, had been purchased with proceeds from the company's growth, which had been funded by my investment. "I've been reviewing our Q3 performance numbers," Mom announced as we sat down to dinner. "Williams Consulting exceeded revenue projections by 18%, and we're on track for our best year ever." "That's incredible, Mom," Jennifer said. "You've really built something special. It's all about understanding market dynamics and having the strategic vision to capitalize on opportunities," Mom continued. "Most people in the consulting space are reactive rather than proactive. They wait for clients to come to them instead of identifying emerging needs and developing solutions." My brother Michael nodded approvingly. "The client list in your last newsletter was impressive. Fortune 500 companies don't typically work with boutique firms unless they're truly exceptional." I continued eating my salad quietly as I typically did during these business discussions. There was no point in mentioning that the Fortune 500 client relationships had largely resulted from strategic partnerships arranged through my investment fund's network, or that the emerging needs Mom had identified were actually market research insights provided by consultants I had hired through one of my portfolio companies. "The key," Mom said, gesturing with her wine glass, "is understanding that consulting isn't just about giving advice. It's about becoming a trusted strategic partner who can guide organizations through complex transformations. You've always had great instincts for that kind of work," Jennifer added. "Even when we were kids, you could see solutions that other people missed." "Exactly," Mom agreed. "Business intuition isn't something you can learn from textbooks. You either have the natural ability to read markets and anticipate client needs, or you don't." I nodded politely and took another bite of my dinner. Mom's business intuition was indeed impressive, though it had been significantly enhanced by the comprehensive market analysis reports and strategic planning documents provided by my investment funds advisory team. The solutions she was famous for developing often originated from detailed research conducted by specialists I had retained specifically to support Williams Consulting's growth. Speaking of natural ability, Mom continued, turning her attention to me, I keep telling people that success in business requires a specific type of mindset. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty, willing to take calculated risks, and able to think several moves ahead. Mom's right, Michael said. Investment banking has taught me that the most successful people are always thinking about long-term strategy while managing immediate challenges. That's exactly the kind of thinking that separates true entrepreneurs from people who just work for other people, Mom said with a meaningful glance in my direction. Some people are content with stable, predictable careers, but real business success requires vision and courage. The family nodded in agreement. This was familiar territory. Mom using her consulting firm's success as a platform to deliver lessons about entrepreneurship and strategic thinking, with the implicit message that I represented everything an ambitious person should avoid becoming. The consulting industry is particularly demanding, Mom continued, because you're constantly dealing with executives who are under enormous pressure to deliver results. If you don't have credibility and expertise, they'll see right through you. How do you maintain that credibility when you're working with such high-level clients? Jennifer asked. Mom leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain her professional philosophy. It's about demonstrating value immediately. When Williams Consulting walks into a boardroom, we don't just present analysis. We present actionable solutions that executives can implement right away. That must require incredible preparation, Michael said. It does. Every client engagement involves weeks of research, data analysis, and strategic planning before we even have our first meeting. That's why Williams Consulting commands premium fees. We're not just consultants, we're strategic partners. I listened with interest as Mom described the extensive preparation process. She was right about the research and analysis being crucial, though she seemed to have forgotten that most of it was conducted by the specialized research team I had funded through one of my investment vehicles. The strategic planning she mentioned was largely based on frameworks developed by business school professors and industry experts who were retained as advisors to my portfolio companies. The best part, Mom said, is that we're just getting started. The management consulting market is evolving rapidly, and Williams Consulting is perfectly positioned to dominate the next phase of growth. What does that mean in practical terms? Jennifer asked. We're developing proprietary methodologies for digital transformation and organizational change management. These aren't just generic consulting approaches, they're specialized frameworks that can't be replicated by our competitors. I almost smiled at that. The proprietary methodologies were indeed valuable, but they had been developed by a team of researchers and consultants working under contract to my investment fund. Mom and her team had contributed important insights and practical experience, but the fundamental intellectual property had been created by specialists I had retained specifically for that purpose. Intellectual property like that must be incredibly valuable, Michael said. It is, Mom agreed. Our projections suggest these methodologies could double our revenue within the next 18 months. As dinner continued, the conversation moved to other topics, but Mom kept returning to her favorite subject, the impressive growth and bright future of Williams Consulting. She discussed upcoming client engagements, potential expansion opportunities, and her plans for establishing Williams Consulting as the premier boutique consulting firm in the region. I remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated appropriate interest without revealing any particular expertise. When Mom explained complex strategic concepts, I nodded as if I was learning something new. When she described challenging client situations, I expressed suitable admiration for her ability to navigate such complexity. By the time we reached dessert, Mom had worked herself into a particularly philosophical mood about business success and personal achievement. You know what separates successful entrepreneurs from everyone else? She asked the table. It's not just intelligence or education. It's having the vision to see opportunities that other people miss. That takes real insight, Jennifer said. It does, Mom agreed. When I started Williams Consulting 8 years ago, Plenty of people told me the consulting market was oversaturated or that I didn't have enough experience to compete with established firms. But I believed in my vision and I was willing to stake everything on it. I took a small bite of chocolate cake and nodded appreciatively. Mom's version of history was always interesting to hear. In her telling, the early days of Williams Consulting had been a heroic struggle against skeptical critics and market headwinds. The reality had been more straightforward. She had presented a competent business plan to my investment team, who had quickly recognized its potential and provided the funding needed for rapid expansion. The most rewarding part, Mom continued, is that Williams Consulting's success proves that you can build something meaningful if you're willing to work hard and think strategically. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start their own business? Michael asked. Mom considered the question carefully. First, you need to have genuine expertise in whatever field you're entering. Second, you need to understand your market better than your competitors do. And third, you need the courage to make decisions when you don't have complete information. Those sound like the qualities that made Williams Consulting successful, Jennifer said. Exactly. But here's the thing, not everyone has those qualities. Some people are naturally risk-averse or lack the strategic thinking required for entrepreneurship. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's important to be honest about your own capabilities. Mom's gaze drifted meaningfully in my direction. Take someone who works in data analysis, for example. That's valuable work and it requires specific skills, but it's fundamentally different from building and running a business. Different people are suited for different roles. The family nodded in understanding. They had all heard Mom's views on this subject before. That I was well suited for analytical work but lacked the vision and risk tolerance required for true business leadership. The data analysis industry is certainly important, Mom continued, but it's primarily about processing information that other people collect rather than making strategic decisions based on that information. That's a good distinction, Michael said. There's definitely a difference between analyzing data and using data to make business decisions. Right, Mom agreed. Williams Consulting uses extensive data analysis in our client work, but the real value comes from interpreting that data and developing actionable strategies. That's where business sense and strategic thinking become crucial. I nodded thoughtfully as if I was genuinely learning something about the distinction between analysis and strategy. In reality, I was the one who had funded the development of Williams Consulting's analytical capabilities and strategic frameworks. The data processing systems Mom relied on had been designed and implemented by specialists working under contract to my investment fund. I've been thinking, Mom said, shifting her focus more directly to me, maybe it's time you considered expanding your skill set. Data analysis is a good foundation, but you're 31 now. At some point you might want to think about developing more business-oriented capabilities. What do you mean? I asked. Well, you could consider an MBA program or maybe some professional development courses in strategic planning or project management. Williams Consulting actually offers some training programs that might be relevant. The family seemed pleased with this suggestion. Mom was offering to help her son develop more marketable skills and potentially advance beyond his current analytical role. The training programs are designed for mid-level managers who want to develop strategic thinking capabilities, Mom explained. They're not cheap, but they could be a good investment in your future. That's generous of you to offer, I said. Obviously, you'd need to demonstrate real commitment and show that you're serious about developing business skills. I can't just hand you opportunities because you're my son. But if you're willing to put in the work, there could be pathways for professional growth. The family was clearly encouraged by this development. Mom was extending a lifeline to her son who had settled for a stable but unremarkable career, offering him the chance to learn from her entrepreneurial success. The business development field is particularly interesting right now, Mom continued. Companies are investing heavily in strategic planning and organizational transformation. If you could develop expertise in those areas, there would definitely be career opportunities available. I appreciate the suggestion, I said. Just remember, Mom added, transitioning from pure analysis to strategic consulting requires a completely different mindset. You can't just process data. You have to synthesize information, identify patterns, and develop recommendations that executives can act on. As the evening wound down, family members began clearing dishes and preparing to leave. Mom lingered in the kitchen with Jennifer and Michael, continuing to discuss Williams Consulting's growth prospects and strategic initiatives. "I'm really proud of what you've built," Jennifer was saying. "Starting a consulting firm from scratch and growing it to this level is incredibly impressive." "Thank you," Mom replied. "It's been challenging but also incredibly rewarding. There's something special about building something that creates value for other people." "The client testimonials on your website are amazing," Michael added. "These are serious executives saying Williams Consulting transformed their organizations." "That's what makes the work meaningful," Mom said. "We're not just providing advice, we're helping companies become more effective and successful." I finished drying the last plate and hung up the dish towel. "I should probably head home," I said. "Early day tomorrow." "Of course," Mom said. "Think about what we discussed tonight. The training program offer is genuine. I really think it could help you develop some valuable business skills." "I'll definitely consider it," I replied. "Don't just consider it," Mom said firmly. "You lack business sense completely. That's why you'll never amount to anything unless you make some serious changes. The analytical mindset is fine for support roles, but real success requires strategic thinking and leadership capabilities." The family nodded in agreement. They had all witnessed Mom's transformation from a small-town consultant to the founder of a thriving firm, and they understood that she was offering to share her expertise with a family member who clearly needed guidance. "You're right," I said simply. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the conversation. Mom had been particularly condescending this time, more explicit than usual about my professional limitations and more insistent on her own superior business acumen. The family had been more supportive of her perspective than typical, nodding along as she explained why my career represented everything she had risen above. It was time for that dynamic to change. Friday morning, I called my venture capital fund from my home office. "Good morning, this is regarding Williams Consulting," I said when my managing partner answered. "I need to initiate an immediate capital withdrawal." "Of course," she replied. "What's the timeline you're looking at?" "I want all funding pulled from Williams Consulting within 72 hours, I said. "Complete liquidation of our position." "That's quite aggressive," she said carefully. "Is there a specific issue with the company's performance?" I thought about Mom's performance over the past 2 years. While Williams Consulting had continued to grow, there had been some concerning developments. She had begun making strategic decisions without consulting the board, had hired several family friends for key positions despite better qualified candidates being available, and had recently started using company resources for personal expenses. More fundamentally, her attitude toward the team and stakeholders had become increasingly problematic. She consistently took credit for strategic insights developed by others, dismissed the contributions of junior staff members, and had begun treating Williams Consulting as her personal kingdom rather than a professionally managed company with fiduciary responsibilities to investors. "Focus on governance concerns and strategic decision-making authority," I said. "Also document the pattern of taking personal credit for team accomplishments and external advisory contributions." "Understood. I'll prepare the withdrawal documentation and notify the company's CFO that we're exercising our liquidation rights. One more thing," I added. "Make sure the notification includes a detailed explanation of why we're withdrawing our investment. I want Williams Consulting's management to understand exactly what behaviors triggered this decision." The withdrawal process began immediately. Williams Consulting's CFO received formal notification that their primary investor was liquidating its entire position due to governance concerns and unauthorized decision-making by company leadership. The legal documentation specified that the withdrawal would be completed within 72 hours as outlined in the original investment agreement. Mom's world began collapsing Friday afternoon. "What do you mean the investors are pulling out?" I could hear Mom's voice through the phone when she called that evening. "This doesn't make any sense. Williams Consulting just had its best quarter ever." "I don't really understand the details," I said. "What exactly did they tell you?" "Something about governance violations and unauthorized strategic decisions. It's completely ridiculous. Every decision I've made has been in the company's best interests." I could hear papers rustling in the background and what sounded like Mom pacing around her office. "Did they give you any specific examples of these governance concerns?" They mentioned taking credit for team contributions and making strategic decisions without board consultation. But that's insane. I'm the CEO and founder. Of course I make strategic decisions. That does sound confusing, I agreed. Have you been able to talk to the investors directly? That's the problem, Mom said, her voice rising with frustration. These people hide behind investment vehicles and corporate entities. I've never even met most of them face to face. Mom spent the next 30 minutes explaining how the investor withdrawal would devastate Williams Consulting's operations. Without the venture capital funding, the company couldn't meet its payroll obligations, maintain its office leases, or continue the research and development projects that were essential to its competitive advantage. The worst part, Mom said, is that I have no idea who these investors actually are or why they're doing this. The withdrawal notice came from some corporate law firm representing anonymous investment entities. That must make it very difficult to resolve the situation, I said. Exactly. How am I supposed to address their concerns when I don't even know who they are or what specifically triggered this decision? By Saturday morning, the implications of the investor withdrawal had become clear. Williams Consulting had 72 hours to find alternative funding or begin shutting down operations. Mom spent the weekend frantically calling potential investors, but no one was willing to provide bridge financing on such short notice. The company's CFO resigned Saturday afternoon, followed by the head of business development on Sunday morning. Several key clients received word of the funding crisis and began discussing contract cancellations with their legal teams. Mom called me Sunday evening, sounding completely defeated. My lawyer says the investors had the legal right to withdraw their funding, she said. Apparently, the original agreements included liquidation clauses that I didn't fully understand. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. Williams Consulting is going to have to file for bankruptcy, Mom continued. 8 years of work and it's all disappearing because of some anonymous investors who decided they didn't like my management style. That's devastating, I said. The thing is, I still don't understand what I did wrong. The company was profitable, growing rapidly, and had excellent client relationships. How does that justify destroying everything I built? Mom's voice carried genuine bewilderment and pain. Despite her flaws, she had worked incredibly hard to build Williams Consulting, and losing the company was a devastating personal and professional blow. What are you going to do now? I asked. I don't know, Mom replied. My lawyer is reviewing whether we have grounds for a lawsuit against the investors, but the withdrawal appears to be completely legal. Over the following days, news of Williams Consulting's collapse spread throughout our family network. The response was shock and confusion. No one could understand how Mom's successful consulting firm had suddenly lost its funding and been forced into bankruptcy. Jennifer called me 3 days after the investor withdrawal. Have you talked to Mom recently? She asked. She seems completely devastated about Williams Consulting. I heard there were some investor conflicts, I said. These situations can be very complicated. She keeps saying the investors betrayed her, but I don't understand why they would destroy a profitable company. I explained that venture capital relationships could become strained when there were disagreements about strategic direction or governance issues. Investors provide funding in exchange for control, I said. When they lose confidence in management, they have the legal right to withdraw their support. But Mom built that company from nothing, Jennifer said. How can they just take it away from her? Founder equity gets diluted during funding rounds, I replied. By the time a company receives significant venture capital, the original founder often owns a relatively small percentage. Jennifer seemed troubled by this information. So Mom never really controlled her own company? She controlled the day-to-day operations, but not the major strategic and financial decisions. That's pretty standard in venture-funded companies. As the weeks passed, Mom struggled to process what had happened to Williams Consulting. The company officially filed for bankruptcy, the office lease was terminated, and the remaining employees were laid off. Mom's house, which had been purchased with proceeds from the company's growth, was at risk of foreclosure since her income had disappeared. More painful than the financial impact was the loss of identity and professional reputation. For 8 years, Mom had been the successful entrepreneur who had built a thriving consulting firm from scratch. Now she was unemployed, fighting with lawyers over severance agreements, and trying to explain to potential employers how her company had collapsed so suddenly. The family rallied around her with support and sympathy, but there was also an undercurrent of confusion and disappointment. Mom had always projected such confidence and expertise about business strategy. The idea that sophisticated investors could simply destroy her company challenged everyone's understanding of how entrepreneurship actually worked. I continued to monitor the consulting industry through my various investment activities. Williams Consulting's client base had been absorbed by larger firms, and the proprietary methodologies Mom had been so proud of were now being implemented by companies with more stable funding structures. 2 months after the bankruptcy filing, Mom called with an update on her situation. "I've been interviewing for senior consulting positions at other firms," she said. "But the Williams Consulting situation keeps coming up, and it's making things very difficult." "How so?" I asked. "Potential employers want to understand why my company failed so suddenly. When I explain about investor conflicts and governance disagreements, they start asking detailed questions I can't really answer. That must be frustrating. The problem is that I still don't know exactly what triggered the investor withdrawal. The legal documentation mentions strategic differences and governance violations, but it doesn't provide specific examples I can address." Mom's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. "I keep thinking there must have been some particular incident or decision that caused this, but I can't figure out what it was. Maybe it was just an accumulation of smaller issues," I suggested. "That's what my lawyer thinks too. But it's hard to explain that to potential employers without sounding like I'm making excuses or avoiding responsibility." As spring turned into summer, Mom's job search continued without success. The consulting industry was small enough that word of Williams Consulting's sudden collapse had spread, and other firms were hesitant to hire a former CEO whose company had been destroyed by investor conflicts. Meanwhile, my venture capital fund had successfully liquidated its position in Williams Consulting and deployed the recovered capital into new investment opportunities. The financial returns had been substantial, though the personal cost to Mom had been higher than I had anticipated. I attended the family 4th of July barbecue at Jennifer's house, where Mom seemed subdued and withdrawn. She still hadn't found a new position and was clearly struggling with the loss of professional identity and financial security. "Any progress on the job front?" Michael asked during dinner. "I'm talking to a few firms," Mom replied vaguely. "The market is pretty competitive right now, especially for senior-level positions." "I'm sure something will work out," Jennifer said encouragingly. "You have too much experience and expertise to stay unemployed for long." Mom nodded but didn't seem convinced. The confident entrepreneur who had dominated family conversations for years had been replaced by someone who seemed uncertain about her future prospects and her own professional capabilities. Later that evening, as family members were cleaning up after the barbecue, Mom approached me privately. "I've been thinking about our conversation at Christmas," she said. "About different types of career success." "Oh," I replied. "You were right that not everyone is cut out for entrepreneurship. Maybe I was too focused on building the biggest possible company when I should have been thinking more carefully about sustainable growth and stakeholder relationships." I nodded thoughtfully. "Those are important considerations. I'm actually considering some independent consulting work or maybe joining an established firm where I wouldn't have to worry about funding and investor relations," Mom continued. "The whole venture capital thing might be more complicated than I understood." "Those could be good options," I agreed. Mom seemed to appreciate the encouragement. I realized I was probably too judgmental about different career paths. There are lots of ways to be successful that don't involve raising venture capital and building massive companies. As autumn arrived, Mom finally found a position as a senior director at an established management consulting firm. The salary was about 40% of what she had been making as CEO of Williams Consulting, and the role involved far less autonomy, but it provided stable income and the opportunity to rebuild her professional reputation. The family was relieved to see her working again, though everyone understood that this represented a significant step back from her previous entrepreneurial success. Mom seemed to be adjusting to her new reality, though she occasionally made bitter comments about investor greed and venture capital politics. At Thanksgiving dinner, our family gathered again at Jennifer's house. Mom attended but seemed reserved compared to previous years. There was no discussion of strategic consulting methodologies or entrepreneurial vision, No confident predictions about market trends or growth opportunities. Instead, the conversation focused on Michael's recent promotion, Jennifer's new partnership track, and my parents' travel plans. When business topics came up, Mom participated politely but didn't attempt to dominate the discussion as she had in the past. I found myself feeling genuinely sympathetic toward her. Despite her condescending attitude and her tendency to dismiss my career, she had worked hard to build Williams Consulting and didn't deserve to lose everything because of governance conflicts that could have been addressed through better communication. As dinner was ending, Mom pulled me aside. "I want to apologize for some of the things I said last Christmas," she said. "I was pretty dismissive of your career and that wasn't fair." "I appreciate that," I replied. "This whole experience has given me a different perspective on business success and professional satisfaction," Mom continued. "I spent so many years focused on building the biggest possible company that I lost sight of other things that matter." "It sounds like you're finding a good balance now," I said. "I'm trying to. The new position is actually quite interesting, and the work-life balance is much better than what I had as a CEO." Mom paused, then added, "I keep wondering what would have happened if I had handled the investor relationships differently. Maybe if I had been more collaborative with the board, or more careful about governance protocols." "It's hard to say," I replied. "Sometimes these situations develop momentum that's difficult to control." "That's true. I just wish I understood exactly what went wrong so I could avoid making similar mistakes in the future." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the events of the past year. Mom had learned important lessons about humility and stakeholder management, though the process had been more painful than necessary. My venture capital fund had successfully liquidated a problematic investment and deployed the capital more effectively. And our family had developed a more realistic understanding of entrepreneurship and the relationship between founders and investors. The irony, of course, was that Mom still had no idea that her son, the one she had dismissed as lacking business sense, had been the primary source of both her initial success and her eventual downfall. But that was a conversation for another day. Perhaps never. Some secrets were more valuable when they remained hidden, allowing everyone involved to draw their own conclusions about business acumen, strategic thinking, and the complex relationship between vision and capital in the modern economy. The important thing was that lessons had been learned, humility had been gained, and the venture capital ecosystem continued to function as designed, rewarding competent management and penalizing governance failures. Everything else was just family dynamics,